You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Founded in 1881, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUVCW.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 463 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast.
As you guys will recall, with last week's show, we set the stage for the February 1864 Battle of Olustee, which, although I'm not sure we mentioned it last week, was the largest engagement that was fought in Florida during the Civil War.
We talked about how by the end of 1863, Florida had become a vital source of provisions for the Confederate military, especially for the Army of Tennessee in northern Georgia, and also the rebel forces commanded by P.G.T. Beauregard defending Charleston, South Carolina.
And on the federal side, we said that by the beginning of 1864, there were both military and political considerations for launching an expedition targeting Northeast Florida. Militarily, it would disrupt the flow of vital supplies the Confederates were receiving from Florida, and so deal a blow to the rebel war effort, but it would also benefit the Union war effort by allowing the Federals access to the interior of Florida and the large population of slaves there. You see, the commander of the Federals Department of the South, Major General Quincy Gilmore, was a proponent of the use of black troops, and he viewed the middle counties of Florida as a prime recruiting ground from which his department could gain large numbers of enlistments from freed and escaped slaves.
So we said that by the end of 1863, beginning of 1864, Gilmore certainly had legitimate reasons for establishing an active federal military presence in Northeast Florida. But then Abraham Lincoln injected politics into the mix as well.
Right. And an idea formed in Lincoln's mind when he learned of Gilmore's upcoming operation. If Florida could be reconstructed fairly easily here early in 1864 under Lincoln's 10% plan, then it would be a state beholding to him for its readmittance to the Union, and could be expected to cast its support to Lincoln in the all-important presidential election that fall.
And so Lincoln wrote to Gilmore on January 13th, telling the general of the reports he'd received regarding Unionist sentiment in Northeast Florida, and saying that he was sending one of his most trusted aides, John Hay, to Florida along with the Army.
Lincoln made clear to Gilmore that he understood the Army's military objectives would take precedence over any politicking by Hay, but the president also said he would be, quote-unquote, greatly obliged if Gilmore gave Hay as much assistance as possible. And that's where we left things last time. And, just to give you a heads up, but this will also be a shortish episode. We've had some unexpected family stuff come up that has left us short of time this weekend, so we thank you in advance for your understanding. We'll move the story a bit farther along with this show and then finish up next time.
After receiving the green light from Washington to set his plan in motion, Gilmore selected Brigadier General Truman Seymour to be in direct command of the expedition.
The 39-year-old Seymour was a West Point graduate, part of the illustrious class of 1846, 20 of whom, including Stonewall Jackson and George McClellan, would serve as generals in the opposing armies during the Civil War. It was Seymour's command, of which the 54th Massachusetts was a part, that had made the unsuccessful assault on Battery Wagner outside Charleston in July 1863. The 54th, of course, gained everlasting fame for their role in the attack, while Seymour himself had been severely wounded in the second wave of the assault when he was hit by a shell fragment. His wound had just healed sufficiently for him to return to duty in December 1863, just prior to Gilmore naming him the Florida Expedition's commander.
The Federals landed at Jacksonville on Sunday, February 7, 1864. It would be the Yankees' fourth occupation of the town so far during the war. The only opposition came from a handful of Confederate cavalry who fired a few shots at the disembarking Union troops and then fled.
The Federal force, 7,000 men strong, was comprised of 3 brigades of infantry, 2 batteries and a section of artillery, and a brigade of cavalry and mounted infantry. The infantry included several regiments of black soldiers, the 8th United States Colored Troops, the 1st North Carolina, and the 54th Massachusetts. FYI, the 1st North Carolina was officially redesignated the 35th United States Colored Troops the second week of February, but for this campaign, the regiment chose to retain its old name.
To oppose the Federals, the Confederate District Commander, Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan, frantically worked to gather together what troops he could, but it was a pitifully small force. By February 10th, he was only able to assemble about 500 infantry, 110 cavalry, and 2 pieces of artillery. Outnumbered by more than 10 to 1, Finnegan could do little more than harass the Yankees while he waited for reinforcements.
The 49-year-old Finnegan was born in Ireland. He had immigrated to Florida when he was in his early 20s and established himself first as a planter, then as an operator of a lumber mill. He had served as a delegate to Florida's Secession Convention and was subsequently placed in charge of the state's military affairs by Governor Milton. In April 1862, Finnegan was commissioned as a brigadier general in the Confederate Army and assigned to command of the District of Middle and Eastern Florida. This despite the fact Finnegan had 0 military experience prior to the Civil War, and Florida's status as a strategic backwater the first 2 years of the war meant he had little occasion to gain any experience leading troops in the field before Olustee.
The Confederate Department Commander, P.G.T. Beauregard, up in Charleston, had little confidence in the inexperienced and untried Finnegan's ability to defeat a determined Federal move into the interior of Florida.
So, when he received word that a large enemy force had landed at Jacksonville, Beauregard not only started to think about what troops he could rush to Finnegan's aid, but another factor in his response was his desire that an officer or officers with considerable combat experience would be sent to Florida to aid or replace Finnegan.
Meanwhile, Seymour was wasting no time. He left a detachment behind to garrison Jacksonville while he headed west, away from the coast, into the interior of Florida. By the morning of the 9th, the Federal advance guard had reached Baldwin, some 20 miles west of Jacksonville.
The little hamlet of Baldwin wasn't much to look at, but it was the junction of two rail lines that the Confederates used to move supplies. The Federals found a well-stocked warehouse there, and any equipment or provisions that couldn't be carried off by the Yankee soldiers or transported back to Jacksonville were destroyed.
After capturing Baldwin, Seymour sent word back to Gilmore, who had accompanied the expedition to Jacksonville, admitting that logistical concerns led him to doubt his ability to advance much beyond Baldwin into the interior of Florida. Seymour invited Gilmore to join him, saying, quote, "If you want to see what Florida is good for, come out to Baldwin."
So it seems that Seymour, after starting out like gangbusters and moving quickly to Baldwin, then lost his nerve a bit after reaching that place. Quincy Gilmore, in turn, appears to have allowed himself to become infected with Seymour's doubts, because later on he would say that when he went out and met with Seymour at Baldwin, he had instructed Seymour not to move further inland, but instead to fortify his position at Baldwin and focus on securing northeast Florida.
After meeting with Truman Seymour at Baldwin, Gilmore went back to Jacksonville, then departed to return to his South Carolina headquarters. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War.
Do you have an interest in the Civil War? Founded in 1881, the SUV-CW is a congressionally chartered, charitable, fraternal organization that preserves the history and legacy of the Union veterans who fought during the Civil War to save the Union and end slavery.
The national headquarters of the SUV-CW is located at the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. When you join, you enter a national network of men who form lifelong bonds, honor their heroic ancestors, and promote historic preservation, education, and patriotism in their communities.
The SUV-CW is the heir to the legacy of the Grand Army of the Republic, the famous post-war National Association of Union Civil War Veterans. Based on the principles of fraternity, charity, and loyalty, the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War accepts both descendants of Civil War veterans and non-descendants. Visit them today at www.suvcw.org or email them at join@suvcw.org.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of the SUV-CW.
How did America go from a struggling series of settlements at the edge of a wilderness into the most powerful, prosperous, influential nation anywhere on Earth? A lot of people say, well, it's just a pattern of happy accidents. But a pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. The American Miracle tells that story. This is Michael Medved. I've been a historian for many years, 14 books, a radio host, fascinated during all that time with the bizarre series of coincidences that allowed the United States to acquire Alaska, or the Louisiana Purchase. Individuals in our past who seem to have been providentially placed where they could make a major difference. Subscribe to the American Miracle on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you get your podcasts.
On February 10th, Seymour sent mounted troops pushing west from Baldwin. But where the advance to Baldwin had been a rapid one, this movement was slower and conducted with a great deal more caution. But the Federal horse soldiers followed the rail line west for 18 miles to Sanderson, and the only opposition they faced along the way was from some worn-out rebel cavalry.
When the Federal troopers rode west from Sanderson, though, they made contact with Finnegan's main body of some 600 Confederates, several miles east of Lake City, where Finnegan had started constructing defensive works. After exchanging fire with the rebels, the Union officer in command, Lieutenant Colonel Guy Henry, decided that his force wasn't strong enough to tackle the enemy without infantry support, so he withdrew back in the direction of Sanderson.
The next day, February 11th, Seymour sent a message to Gilmore saying, quote, "I am convinced that a movement upon Lake City is not admissible, and indeed what has been said of the desire of Florida to come back now is a delusion. As far as I can learn yet, Lake City will be defended by more infantry and artillery than I have with me."
Seymour was not only wildly overestimating the number of Confederates at Lake City at that moment, but in his message to Gilmore, he went on to propose that, rather than remain at Baldwin and work at securing the surrounding area, he should instead give up all the territory already captured in the interior, and his force ought to pull all the way back to Jacksonville.
While Seymour was wavering, Finnegan was receiving reinforcements. By the 13th, he had around 2,000 men on hand, and 5 days later, by the 18th, the arrival of more troops, including a brigade of veteran Georgians under Brigadier General Alfred Colquitt, had swollen Finnegan's numbers to some 5,500 men.
During those days, while Beauregard was forwarding reinforcements to him, as the men arrived, Finnegan kept them busy strengthening the line of earthworks east of Lake City near the railroad stop of Olustee.
The position selected by Finnegan would allow the Confederates to fight on the defensive from their earthworks and use the terrain in the vicinity to their advantage. The rebel left flank was anchored on Ocean Pond, a large body of water 4 miles long and 2.5 miles wide that emptied into the Okefenokee Swamp. In fact, sometimes in Confederate accounts, the upcoming battle is called Ocean Pond rather than Olustee. Well, in any case, the right of Finnegan's line was anchored on another smaller pond. Swampy terrain to his front right would further limit the room in which the Yankees would be able to maneuver. And all along the defensive line itself, the ground was open pine forest with very little undergrowth.
While Finnegan, on the Confederate side, was receiving reinforcements and working to strengthen his line of earthworks at Ocean Pond, on the Federal side, Seymour was once again changing his mind about the prospects of continuing offensive operations and marching farther into the interior.
Seymour decided that now, rather than pulling back to the coast, to Jacksonville, he would march boldly west from Baldwin and strike the Confederates a blow. Seymour's reasoning behind, and the objective he had in mind, in making this movement is unclear, although it appears his goal was perhaps to destroy a railroad bridge farther inland over the Suwannee River. At any rate, John Hay, for one, was tiring of Seymour's constantly changing outlook, and Lincoln's man on the scene was losing faith in the vacillating general. Hay wrote, quote, "Seymour has seemed very unsteady and queer since the beginning of the campaign. He has been subject to violent alternations of timidity and rashness, now declaring Florida loyalty was all bosh, now lauding it as the purest article extant, now insisting Beauregard was in front with the whole Confederacy, and now asserting that he could whip all the rebels in Florida with a good brigade."
When Seymour sent a message to Gilmore informing his superior of his new plans, Gilmore was appalled. His last instructions to Seymour had been to fortify Baldwin and secure the ground already won in northeast Florida.
Then Seymour had said he was outnumbered by the Confederates at Lake City, and he was contemplating withdrawing to Jacksonville.
And now here was Seymour saying he was going to undertake an offensive movement and march west, farther into the interior.
Well, Quincy Gilmore, from his headquarters up in South Carolina, at once sent an aide off to Florida to communicate orders canceling Seymour's planned offensive. But bad weather delayed the messenger, and as fate would have it, he didn't reach Seymour until after the Battle of Olustee was already over.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Thunder on the River, The Civil War in Northeast Florida by Daniel L. Schaefer. Don't forget you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Landon and Kelsey A., Jonathan W., David H., John L., Michelle H., and Ted J. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Also, a big thank you to Christopher M. and Raphael M. for their recent donations.
Just a reminder that the lovely music you hear at the start and at the close of every episode is from the song Midnight on the Water, and we use it with the kind permission of Spiritwood Music, for which they have our eternal gratitude.
And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.